I'm gonna put one here. The first one is yours.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started shortly, so if we can all take our seats. And if you have any friends that are outside, let them know we're getting started. Okay, well, thank you all beautiful people for being here for such an important conversation. Good morning. My name is Grace Bonilla, and I am the president of United Way of New York City. And I cannot tell you how excited and how much work has gone into launching this study today. I'm here, yes. I'm here with my partner in crime in many things, but for today, it's the true cost of living, Lisette Nieves, the president for the Fund for the City of New York. And we could not have done this without their partnership and commitment to making sure that we understand what it takes to live in the city. I will also like to thank Lisa Manser and Annie Kolklick. Where are you two? Hello, ladies. These are the amazing people who have been doing this study from the University of Washington, and I know you're going to hear from them. Thank you for your work, and thank you for focusing in on New York City the way you have. I think we've learned a lot from the work that you've done. I also would love to thank, so as many of you know, United Way has been a staple in the city for 85 years. Working for the underserved, working for vulnerable communities has been the staple of what we've done throughout many generations. And this is really a full circle moment for a lot of us. We have the wonderful former Deputy Mayor Lillian Barrios Paoli, who was at United Way when the first study was commissioned. We have our amazing Myrble Regan, who is here today as well. And Myrble, the way you brought this particular tool to the city and have launched this since 2000 has been such an honor, and thank you so much that we get to learn from all of the work that you two ladies did for the city of New York. But this is a tool that is also used on a national scale, and I also want to thank Diana Pierce, I think is here. Diane Pierce! So Dr. Diane Pierce created the standard, now known as the true cost of living here in New York City, and it's been utilized, like I said, in 40 states. So thank you, Diane, for also being a trailblazer at a national level. The fact that we're here at the Ford Foundation is also very much a full circle moment, since Ford Foundation was one of the funders of the first study for New York City. So we are here because, unfortunately, we still need this study. We still need to figure out what does it really live in dignity in the city of New York. And we all know, because of the pandemic, many of the studies that we've done in the past are so outdated, but the reality is that people in New York City are worse off in many ways than they were even before the last study was published. So part of what you're going to hear today from many of the panelists is where are we today and what can we do? And our hope is that the true cost of living study can be a tool for all of us to push for equity, to push for a city that is just and equitable, where everyone can thrive. When we think about where we were since the last study, 36% of working New Yorkers were not making enough to make ends meet and meet the cost of living for a month in New York City. Today, that number is 50%. And you'll hear where, in what parts of the city, we really need to focus in and get some work done in order to make a difference. You're here because you're committed to this work. You're here, and I see so many faces, people that I've worked with throughout my career. We are all committed to making sure that a post-pandemic New York is equitable for all New Yorkers. So I hope that you will spread the word, talk about the study, talk about what you hear today, and make sure that we are not leaving any New Yorker behind. So at this moment, I'd like to hand it over to Lisette Nieves, who is going to take us through the next part of today's events. Lisette, president of the Fund for the City of New York, and my hermana, thank you for being with us and coming up.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So Grace, thank you for that introduction. Most importantly, thank you for your work. right? And thank you for your leadership right now of the United Way. For many of us, we are beyond inspired to have you there, right? We know leadership matters, yes. Leadership matters, right? So I get to represent the Fund for the City of New York today. Since 1968, the Fund has led innovations in policies and programs and practices to strengthen government and nonprofit organizations. And this is a full circle moment for us because 55 years ago, literally the fund was started by the Ford Foundation, right? So when you think about institutions in this city, the United Way is an institution, the Fund for the City of New York is an institution, but the Ford Foundation seeded and inspired institutions. And I'm really excited about that because it also seeded and inspired this report, right? We appreciate the opportunity to hold this event here, and as Grace said earlier, it's important to recognize so many of the leaders that are in this room. I can't go by each one by name, but there are 23 distinct organizations who have put in time, who put in energy, talent, treasure, all of it, to make sure that this report can come to fruition, right? Once again, it's never one person, it's an entire community that helps make this happen. Although she couldn't join us today, I'd like to also thank First Deputy Mayor Sheena Wright because she was an unwavering advocate for the true cost of living, also former CEO of the United Way, and someone who has used her platforms of advocacy wherever she's been to make sure the values around human dignity, respect, engagement, support for those who are the least enfranchised in the city are visible. So let's give a thanks to Sheena as well. Another important voice is this idea that any of these activities that happen, particularly in thinking about launching this report, is that it doesn't happen because of one voice, right? It happens because of multiple voices, right? And I'm going to go through a few key ones here. And one of the key voices as well is Jennifer Jones-Austin, the CEO and Executive Director of FPWA. And though she wasn't able to join us here, Raisa is here to join us, right? Thank you, right there. Jennifer is a social justice leader and a powerful advocate for truly measuring basic needs. As a chair of the Racial Justice Commission, she led the development of the measure that passed last year, which requires the city to track the actual cost of meeting basic needs in New York starting in 2024, right? So here we have, think about it, this incredible group of researchers. We have an incredible group of practitioners who say, guess what, research shouldn't be done in isolation. It should be rooted, and I'm going to get to Myrble in a minute, it should be rooted in the work that we do. Then we have these incredible advocates who carry the message. Think about what are the political opportune moments. Then we have the funders. Look at all the people that have been involved in moving this forward, right? Right? This isn't work that started yesterday, right? Dignity, particularly around families, working class families, is not a new issue, right? But it took this kind of, what I say, this kind of kismetic energy. I like when I create a new word. There we go. Energy that really makes this happen. And each of the people I'm talking about represent a piece of that timeline that made that happen. I'd also like to thank Raisa Rodriguez, who's right there. There we go, the Chief Program and Policy Officer of FPWA. She has not only works with Jennifer Jones-Austin, she's also dedicated her time, her treasure, her focus, and her team to do this, to support it. So thank you. I'll be introducing our panelists later, right? But it's important on this release to think about a few things that I think need to happen. We can't say enough about Myrble. Now, I know she's like, no. And I'm going to say it again, yes, right? Because, yeah, and you know, they're like, you're going off script. I am going off script. Sorry, everyone. Just saying that in case anyone's freaking out. Yes, sorry. I'll take those 30 seconds back at the end. But what I think is important for folks to understand is that it's not often the weaver or the connection between policy and research happens by someone who clearly has only kept the focus, particularly of women who have been ignored and disenfranchised. And that's what you've done, and that's why this is here. So we should give you another thank you for that. We have a few council members. I want to make sure that we recognize Councilmember Brewer, Councilmember Bottcher, Councilmember Velasquez, and other guests joining us today. I apologize ahead of time if I do not say your name. As Grace mentioned, the report is an essential tool for all of us so we can have just policies related to wages and benefits. The New York City True Cost of Living is a basic needs measure that stands in contrast to the official poverty measure. The OPM is outdated, but it's still used to gauge poverty, resulting in serious undercounting as well as misconceptions about wages people need to survive and much less thrive. It also doesn't take into account regional differences, the idea of regional economies. What does it mean to live in one state versus another state? And we see that. The OPM is also used when determining eligibility. Pretty important when we think about essential programs like SNAP, Medicaid, CHIP, and the National School Lunch Program. As you can see, if we want to ensure the well-being of New Yorkers, we must measure the true cost of living. It's a critical time to do so. This report puts face-to-face with sobering reality. The rate of income inadequacy among working households in New York City is 50%. Think about that, 50%. The rate has grown significantly since the last report in 2021, when we saw 36% of working-age households were struggling to make ends meet. And when we talk about working-age households, we're talking between 18 and retirement age. I think that's important for people to understand, okay? This reflects the impact of the pandemic and is an urgent call to action. No surprise when we think about the pandemic. Who's left behind? Families, people who were disproportionately in a service industry that has been gutted, right? Two of the key rising costs, what are they? Childcare, food, right? Think about those things. Since the report's first publication in 2000, we've never seen a percentage as high in growth. It's important to highlight the report also underscores how various forms of inequity intersect to magnify those most vulnerable, such as single mothers. 80% of working-age households headed by singles mothers struggle to meet ends meet. Wow, right? Think about that, right? Latinx single mother-led households are the most vulnerable in that population, with 87% lacking sufficient income. The highest rates of working-age households struggling with income inadequacy are found in the Bronx. And that's also where we've seen the highest percentage increase of food costs. We get that? Right? And then also particularly the Central Bronx, parts of Brooklyn, including Brownsville and Ocean Hill. While employment is key to income adequacy in New York, it doesn't guarantee stability. In fact, 40% of working-age households that struggle to make ends meet have at least one full-time year-round worker, right? Right? So think about dispelling narratives. And the beauty is we're in a room of people who are here, who are champions for all citizens, we would say here. But the narrative is that people aren't working. They are working. They are doing everything they were told to do to reach a dream. Work hard, put your children in school, right? And still cannot make ends meet. There's a broken contract here, and this report really highlights that broken contract. We're going to hear a bit more about the findings from the report today, but we'll also discuss promising practices and policies that would help us move forward, because this is a timely and important moment, right? We have to be opportunistic. It's very exciting that the city wants to look at what does a true cost of living mean and how this report can influence that. Before we dive into our first panel discussion, it is my pleasure to bring us some joy as well. And the joy is going to come in the 2023 New York City Youth Poet Laureate, college student and organizer from the Bronx, Stephanie Pacheco. Now I'm going to say a couple of things about you, okay? Stephanie's poetry and advocacy have been highlighted by the Today Show, the New York Times, CBS, and more. Look at her, just take it in, right? Do you feel the joy? Are you ready? I'm ready, right? She's been a leading organizer and strategist with several activist organizations, including the Healing Centered Schools Task Force, the Alliance for Quality Education, working to mobilize youth across the city against educational injustice. She's a recipient of the 2021 Princeton Prize in Race Relation and is a member of Urban World New York City's 2022 SLAM team. Her goal is to continue to uplift her community using her words as tools for, quotes, liberation and championing the belief that a better world is possible. let's get to hear from Stephanie now, who reminds us that a better world is possible. Welcome.
Hello, good morning, everyone. So this first poem that I have to share is in commemoration of the 70s era in the South Bronx, of the Bronx's burning. Though I was in fact not there for it, I'm constantly in the legacy of those who were. And this is a poem that has grown a lot since I've written it, but here it is. My grandfather and I are sat at our dinner table. He knows this neighborhood like he knows legacy, like the back of his hand. He tells me he used to drive around this block in the early 80s and all these buildings were burned, were demolished, that these sidewalks were falling apart. He tells me that people were hungry, starved by powers who could never love us the way we love each other. He says, what is now was not always. What was then will not be now. They called it ruin, called the collapsing of buildings bound to be, said we must have lit the inferno ourselves, called this hell already, spoke of spilled stovetops, but all of us who are from here, who learned to breathe here, knew it to be an implosion, knew that these buildings were not made for this kind of poverty. How many neighbors do we know have been forgotten? On the other side of the margin, we have always known redlining to just be a metaphor for the most American way to bleed. And still, in all this smoke, I have not forgotten what I know, what my elders have always taught me. I know this ash. I know I was not born a tragedy. I know that we are more than ruin. I know darkness only means that light is coming again. And like my burrow, today I still stand. I am of the kids born in the year of the blackout. They called it a power outage. I call it surviving. My grandfather says that we are the gift and the promise of tomorrow. So let us be the torch passed down. So, dear blackout baby, flamethrower, fire breather, turn of the century children, to those of us who learned to breathe here, who know what it is to burn as much as they know to be the flame, know that they will say your name wrong. They will call you criminal, call you delinquent, call you thug, call you the cause of combustion. When they do, tell them no. Say we nod our heads and pay respect in this hood. Tell them no. Point at this mosaic we've made and tell them we call it beautiful. We call it ours. Tell them how we watched our neighborhood unfold into an unnatural disaster. Watch poverty flash before our eyes and still stand. If there is one thing that won't go up in flames, it's that dream, that hope to be destined. Tell them how they set our homes on fire and tried to turn us into ash. Then tell them how we coughed through the smoke anyway and survived it. Tell a different story in your bubble letters. Don't let them forget you. Strike a match at their toes and make them have light feet. Do that little Bronx thing you be doing. Do that little uptown thing you be doing. Do a little 2-turntable remix for them. Say that the fire next door will be the fire this time. This country, this city has taken my neighbor's home, my sister and my brother's home, my grandfather and my daughter's home. We will not wait for their rebuilding. Say that we will build us a new home. It will be big enough to fit us all. It will have everything we lost in the fire. It will be fireproof. It will hold our bodies sacred. It will bear a holiness that they can't burn. Thank you. Thank you. Is that all of my time? One more? Just one more? Okay. So I was hoping that with my time I would have just one more to offer you all. This is a poem that I wrote after, meaning inspired by another poet. His name is Martín Espada, another person whose legacy I am constantly in awe of. And I call it, This is the Year. This is the year that every black girl on the block lets their hair out to speak with the sun, and the concrete sings a gospel tune with 2 swinging ropes on beat. This is the year that empty dining tables in every South Bronx apartment shall have the grandest feast. Be the first supper, like turning water into wine. This is the year that there is no water leaking from the ceiling, where faucets run clear in Flint, and sunken kin rise from the ocean, sending a wave of revival crashing on shore. This is the year that precincts are replaced with basketball courts and community centers. Wailing sirens are obsolete, and those who left empty spaces on the block filled by only their memory make their grandest return. Our elders replenish the block with their rejoice of freedom, and every cell in Rikers whistles an empty wind. This is the year that pavement gardens grow to more than a rose, when the concrete jungle becomes a rainforest, where we let the community fire hydrant flow, like we've done every year anyway, this time with more to be celebrated and more flowers to let bloom. This is the year that my mother calls off job 1 and 2, props her burning feet and chemical wrinkling hands up on the couch, and no tears drop from her eyes from the scorch of cleaning someone else's home to survive. This is the year that there are no gunshots, no brutal cop, no 6th floor mother with her palms clasping each other, sending silent prayers to whoever's baby that may be. There will be no body on the ground and no funeral the following weekend. This is the year that the Bronx is not on fire, where we sit on castle thrones instead of piles of rubble, and charred insurance money vanishes from the hands of slumlords. This is the year that the Whole Foods in Harlem turns into a jazz club, where we call for a second Harlem Renaissance, and our hum tunes of liberty are sent into the air. This is the year that every school has every notebook, every pencil, every brand name crayon box waiting on brand new desks. Every mirrored teacher and the textbooks trace stories to the other side of the middle passage, speaking the names of Assata Shakur and Harriet Tubman. This is the year that cramped public housing apartments are renovated into mansions, and property owners and gentrifiers are locked out at the gate. If the handed meals of our youth began with the idea that none of us should know hunger better than we know ourselves, then this is the year. If rebellions were crafted by the exhaust of worn souls and the heat of whipped backs who refused to take another, then this is the year. If we built a nation with our own hands and determined it our diction to turn it on its head, if we deem it never being of use, then this is the year. So may all of our forgotten people know abundance, and may every disempowered soul with wrist all bruised and blistered claim their existence to be righteous and take their freedom into their own hands. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Never go on after a poet like that. Thank you, Stephanie. It's interesting, they call you the Youth Poet Laureate. You're my Poet Laureate. Youth or otherwise. I love it. Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our first panel discussion this morning, which is going to delve into importance of the New York City True Cost of Living Report and findings. Our moderator, Dr. Lilium Barrios Paoli, who is someone who has mentored, supported, and labored to have so many of us be seen and visible. I thank you deeply for that. Is currently serving as a senior advisor to the president of Hunter College with a focus on special projects and community partnership. We are thrilled to have her moderate this discussion given her tenure in New York City government, where she serves as Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services and Commissioner of the New York City Department for Aging, among other roles. She also served as a Senior Vice President and Chief Executive for Agency Services at United Way of New York City for 6 years. Look at the full circles that are happening here, where she supported the investment in the first New York City True Cost of Living report in 2000. Thank you. Please feel free to come on up. I'm also thrilled to welcome Myrble Regan, the former Executive Director of the Women's Center for Education and Career Advancement in New York City. Myrble has worked for more than 40 years to create greater opportunities for low-wage workers across sectors. She's been a powerful leader for economic and gender equity and has advocated for systemic changes in support of low-wage working families, particularly women, right? Absolutely. She initiated the first New York City True Cost of Living report in 2000, clarifying for us the pervasiveness of economic struggles among working families across our city. Myrble won't tell you this or her bio, but she is also a civil rights pioneer in this country. Yes, yes she is. Has been someone who has, at every moment of her life, lived her values first and forward. We're so lucky to have you. Welcome, Myrble. We're also excited to welcome Lisa Manzer, the Director of the Center for Women's Welfare at the University of Washington. Committed to economic justice and supporting low-income families, Lisa has dedicated over 2 decades to development and implementation of the self-sufficiency standard, a basic needs measure that is known as a true cost of living in New York City. Lisa's collaborated with partners across the United States to produce numerous reports on the impact of housing, childcare, healthcare, guaranteed basic income, and tax policies on working families. She will share more about the report findings and research methods with us. Before I turn it over to Lillian, I want to make sure to also just give one thanks and recognition to the United Way of New York City, led by Grace Bonilla. This event, the energy, the enthusiasm, down to the details, right, has been done through partnership, but led very much by the United Way, and I want to acknowledge that too. So let's give a thank you to them. And with that, I get to turn it over to Lillian.
Okay, it's on. So, good morning, everyone. I'm very thrilled to be here. I must say that it's an honor to be next to Myrble and Lisa, and also Diana Pierce, who's in the audience, who was the real creator of the self-sufficiency report standard. So when Myrble came to see me when I was at United Way, and talked to me about the self-sufficiency standard, I thought it was a no-brainer. I thought, oh my God, we finally are going to stop blaming the victim, because we always were told that poor people just couldn't budget. It was their fault. If they just were a little more sensible and spend in the right way, all things will be really well. And what the self-sufficiency standard showed us is that you just didn't have enough money, period. That it was an economic reality in their life that they just couldn't make ends meet because they just didn't have enough to make ends meet. So it's a real honor to be here with Myrble and Lisa. And please, I mean, I cannot say enough good things about Myrble, although Lisette did say some. And I would just like Myrble to tell us a little bit about the history of the self-sufficiency, now the true cost of living, and how did it get started? Why did you think it was important? How did you come upon the realization that we needed it?
Thank you, Lillian. The Women's Center for Education had been serving women, low-income women, since the year 1970. So by the late 1990s, women had gone through our training programs, they had started their own businesses, they had gone back to school, they had improved their skills. all of the things that we had talked with women around New York City about in terms of what would help them to better their situations. They started coming back to us after they had gotten better jobs, saying that they were having trouble with credit. And so we collaborated with a consumer credit counseling service to see what the issues were for the individual families. And what we discovered in fairly short order is that they were not abusing credit. They were using credit to supplement low wages. And in those days, the only measure we had was the poverty measure, which clearly was not enough money to talk about income security for New York City working families. And so when we learned about Diana Pierce's self-sufficiency standard and took a look at the methodology and the results of that research, we thought, this makes sense. Rather than talking about how poor people are not, let's start with what they actually need and how we can help them to get it. So we were thrilled with the knowledge that this research existed and went to Lilium and also Pat White at New York Community Trust. And they both generously handed over the funding to make this possible. And then we began, yes, so thank you, a million times. And then we began to recruit other organizations across all 5 boroughs to help us think about the best ways to use, to not only gather the data, but the best ways in which to use it to help New York City families. Because we realized there was a difference in terms of families that lived in South Manhattan, North Manhattan, the Bronx, ultimately Northwest Brooklyn versus the rest of Brooklyn, Staten Island, and Queens. And we thought that the ability to develop that research and information with that detail was going to be very important for New York City working families. Also, we realized that a single person had different budget items than a family. And as women, we understood that there was a difference if you had an infant, a preschooler, a school-age child, and a teenager, because the budget items varied based on the ages of the children. So ultimately, the self-sufficiency standard enabled us to determine that information. I don't remember the exact number, but it's over 700 configurations if you start with a single person and you go to 4 adults and 3 teenagers. There are over 700 combinations. The self-sufficiency standard enabled us to work with families with that degree of specificity so that a woman making a minimum wage with 3 young children understood that her needs were different from a family with a different configuration. For the women, it was a boon because they stopped blaming themselves. As Lilium said, the conventional information was if they're not doing well and they're using credit, then they're not being smart about money. This armed them with the information that here was a goal to which they could aspire, and they set about doing that. And I really do want to thank again the United Way, historically and today, as well as New York Community Trust. Over the years, we have worked with about 50 organizations who collaborated with us in terms of the research, as well as the public policy recommendations. And I will say that this most recent report is excellent, and this is my swan song, and it is in good hands.
And mine. So Lisa, tell us a little bit about the methodology that is used to develop the true cost of living, and who uses it, and what should it be used for?
Yeah, thank you. So before I dig into the methodology of the true cost of living, I just want to go back to the official poverty measure and talk a little bit about that methodology and the limitations with it, and just kind of how it was originally developed. So at this point, it is 6 decades old. It was developed by Molly Orshansky with the Social Security Administration back in the 1960s. And she started from the basic concept that food is, one of the most basic needs. And so from there, she was able to price out what the cost would be for a family of 4 to minimally meet their nutritional standards. So then she had the budget for food and multiply that by 3, and that became the poverty threshold. And other than updates for inflation, it has stayed pretty much unchanged to this day. It doesn't vary geographically, and that's pretty important for someplace like New York City, right? And it doesn't vary by ages of children, which infants, preschoolers, school age, teenagers, though you're gonna experience some different costs there. So, at this point, it is just outdated and too low. And at this point, food costs are much less than 1/3 of a household's budget. Other costs have been increasing substantially. And we heard it earlier that so many programs are using the official poverty measure, SNAP, WIC, school nutrition programs, and it's just insufficient to really measure what it takes to meet basic needs. And so that's where the true cost of living comes in to measure what households really need to get by in a given city for a given family type. We take a market basket approach to measuring the costs. So we measure each cost of basic need individually. We're not looking just at food. What that means is we're going to add up the costs of housing, so rent and utilities, childcare costs while parents are working, healthcare costs, so premium, insurance premium, and out-of-pocket costs, transportation costs for commuting to and from work. Let's see, we have miscellaneous expenses such as basic access to internet, a cell phone, having clothing and paper products, any other just kind of basic necessities. And then we assume that this is, earned income, that someone's working, so they're paying payroll taxes, and we include other local, state, federal income taxes and tax credits on that threshold. And we do this in a calculation that is a basic needs budget. It is pretty bare bones. It's just the minimum. So it doesn't have any extras really included. And we're also assuming these costs are at the market level. So we're not including the addition of any public or private subsidies into the availability of those costs. And importantly, we vary those costs geographically, at the county, borough, or subborough levels, and we vary by the ages of children. So that's important for infants and preschoolers with full-time childcare, school age with part-time childcare. And then also food costs for teenagers really increases as well. So it's not just about childcare. There's all these different variations. And so, let's see. Right. So at this point, the official poverty measure for a family of 4 this year is $30,000. I was looking at our data for Queens for a 2-bedroom. That's it. That's $30,000. So then that leaves nothing left after housing to cover food, for childcare, any other basic expenses. And looking at family type of 2 adults, a preschooler and school-age child, across all boroughs, the true cost of living is over $100,000 and even over $150,000 in South Manhattan. So clearly, the official poverty measure is just, it's not enough. It's not going to cut it.
Right, and then, we wonder why there's homelessness. We wonder why people get evicted in a continual cycle. And it's simply because there's just not enough money. And, it's one way or the other. You either get a bigger salary or you get a subsidy. And, you're going to pay either way. It's just that you have to choose how you're going to pay for it. As a policymaker, as a social services agency, as whatever, it's the reality is that there's just the wages as they are not enough in the city of New York to support living in the city of New York. So Lisa, what is different about the report this year than in years past?
Yeah, I'll go into, touching on kind of the main findings that we've had in this report. And as we heard earlier, the headline finding is that 50%, half of households in New York have inadequate income according to the true cost of living. That is staggering. And it was, last time when we did this report, when we released it 2 years ago, it was 36%. So that is the biggest increase we've ever saw. And the 36% when we did this report 2 years ago, that was actually the lowest income inadequacy rate we had ever calculated for the city. So things have been increasing a lot. And I'm going to go into some more detailed findings as well, but I want to first touch on the methodology for that. Like, how do we get that 50%? Where does that number come from? So for that, we start with the American Community Survey. So we use the 2021 year microdata set. The microdata set gives us a sample of actual cases from the American Community Survey, and that allows us to look specifically at households and their income, where do they live, how many adults are in that household, what's the number and ages of children in the household. That gives us the information we need to individually match each case in the American Community Survey with their true cost of living. So from there, we're able to say if the household income is equal to or greater than the true cost of living, then, they have adequate income. If it's less than the true cost of living, they have inadequate income, and those are the households that are struggling to meet their basic needs. They lack, they're at risk of falling behind on rent, and they're at risk of going hungry. They're at risk of meeting any of their basic needs. So another methodology point I wanted to talk about a little bit more just to kind of help with understanding the findings is that the data reflects that of households that have a working age adult without a work-limiting disability. And that's because the cost assumptions in the true cost of living look specifically at work-related costs. So that's transportation to commute to and from work, childcare costs while parents are working. Our health insurance cost assumption assumes employer-sponsored insurance, and then we also include payroll taxes. So we limit the universe of our sample to households that have a working age householder that meets that criteria. And overall, that's 80% of all households in New York City.
Can you tell us of any industry, any state that is using the true cost of living as a standard?
Yeah, so at this point, we have a lot of states that are using the true cost of living, the self-sufficiency standard. Diana first calculated this in 1996, and we now have the standard in over 42 states. So it's getting used a lot. Thanks. So the state of Wisconsin is using the standard as their income eligibility threshold for federally funded workforce training programs. Other workforce agencies across the state do as well. The state of Washington now is using the self-sufficiency standard as their definition of the standard of need. And so that means that they are setting the maximum benefit maximum grant amount for temporary assistance needed families, supplemental security income, refugee assistance, among other programs on the self-sufficiency standard.
Can be done.
Let's see. In Oregon, the legislature used the standard for setting the state 3-tier minimum wage scale. And let's see, Colorado used the standards in how they're setting their income eligibility thresholds for child care assistance. Oh, and in Connecticut, we've been doing some interesting work with the development of a healthcare affordability index. And the state is using that to model the impact of different policy levers, such as changes to the premium tax credit, changes to their state EITC, and seeing what will the impact be on the ability of Connecticut families to meet basic
What
needs.
about the private sector? Is anyone there using it as a threshold for their entry-level wages?
Yeah, so IKEA actually has been using the self-sufficiency standard. They've been, actually been funding a lot of the updates now for the data in several of the states, and it's been a great partnerships we've been having with them. They use the self-sufficiency standard as part of their base wage algorithm for varying the costs between their U.S. stores.
Wow. So Myrtle, when you brought the self-sufficiency standard to legislators, to policymakers, what was the reception?
We can't afford it. They didn't even want to have the discussion. And so, we all, many of you in this room have been persisting since the year 2000 to still bring this to the attention of policymakers, but not just policymakers. I mean, it has applications far beyond those that Lisa just talked about. So in another part of my life, I work with indigent legal services. And let's see, 7 years ago, I went to a meeting of people involved in indigent legal services across New York State. Excuse me, and I was proposing that they use a multiple of the poverty measure to determine eligibility for indigent legal services, not just criminal, but juvenile and family as well. Because there wasn't at the time an updated state standard. And so this is an audience of lawyers and judges, and there were several hundred people there, and instead of making a speech or a presentation, I asked that if I could take 10 minutes to have them do an exercise, because preaching numbers at people just doesn't resonate typically. And so I said, I took Cayuga County, which is sort of the middle income level in New York State, and I asked them to do a budget exercise with a family with 2 working parents, an infant, and a school-age child. And we just whipped through the budget categories that Lisa mentioned, and they came up with an income of about $20,000. I won't say it's because the mostly male audience doesn't understand what family budget items actually are, but that may have been a part of it. And they came up with something like under $30,000 for this family of 4. And then we showed them the self-sufficiency numbers, which were more than double. And these are people who make public policy, and they really do not have information necessarily about what it costs to take care of a family. I mean, the general wisdom is you never ask anybody their wage, you never tell them yours, and so we don't grow up learning this. I mean, these are numbers that high school students can understand easily and gives them a context in which to think about their further education and what it takes to raise a family. So I'm saying that the application of the self-sufficiency standard, now the true value, the true cost of living, has applications across the board in areas that we don't even think about. I mean, eligibility for lots of services. Yes. And I don't remember the state in which the sort of visual was told to us, but it's like you think about what's happening in working families in New York City since the year 2000. You think of it as an alligator mouth. So here you have, these are wages, these are costs, and this is what's happening to our working families. And it just doesn't make sense. They can't get ahead. They can't even stay even because the cost of living in New York City greatly outdistances what wages are. So our solution, and the solution of many people who discuss this, is to think about a combination, as Lisa alluded to, which is it's a combination of raising wages and increasing benefits eligibility, if we truly care about our families. Because if our system is working on the backs of people who are not earning enough money to make ends meet, they're doing all the right things, then what are we talking about in terms of quality of life?
And the thing is that you pay for it anyway. I mean, the budget that we're using now for homeless services is over $4 billion a year. So think about housing subsidy instead of shelter, the right to housing as opposed to the right to shelter, simply because, as Lisa pointed out, if in Queens it costs $30,000 a year to have a two-bedroom apartment, even if you have a one-bedroom apartment, it's, what, $18,000 a year? If you make $30,000, there's no way you can sustain that over time. And you'll end up homeless, and you'll go into cyclical homelessness. But that is true about the quality of education your children receive, about the kind of nutrition your children get, about the kind of, just life that they have, that they lead. So it's, it's you pay one way or the other. It's just, I used to say that the scholarship to Harvard may be $55,000 or maybe more now. The scholarship to Rikers is a lot more expensive. It's about double.
That is true.
So it's one way or the other. So, Lisa, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think with that $30,000 that I mentioned earlier for housing costs, that is up 18% from 2 years ago. That is a really big increase. Wages have not been keeping up at that level. Childcare increased, I think it was 21% for a preschooler and school-age child. Mm-hmm. And, housing and food costs increase as well, around 20,000, varying from 18 to 22% depending on borough. So costs are increasing, wages are not. I think I touched earlier that the standard was first calculated in 2000. That was 23 years ago. So that family I was using with 2 adults, preschooler and school age in Queens, that's 125% increase since it was first calculated. And median earnings across the boroughs, 71% over that same period. So it's the alligator mouth that you're talking about.
So I know that you all have small note cards. If you want to write some questions in them, I think that we'll take some questions from the audience. I've always wanted to do this.
And I'll share that
And the winner is 36% below the TCL. The true cost of living is low, 50 below, the truth is high. What is the normal on average for people living below the true cost of living?
So in last calculation, when we did the report a couple years ago, 36% is what we found, and that was a decrease of 4%. So around the 42% is what we had typically been finding for New York City households. And we've done these studies in quite a few states, and New York City has always been the highest results that we have gotten for any sort of geographic area. In most states, we find that the overall percentage is more in the 22 to kind of 28% range. So, we've always found a much higher rate here in New York City. Mm-hmm.
Well, it tells us a lot about income inequality in New York City, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
And what to do. I guess we you know, we need to, it'd be great if we could use the true cost of living to figure out benefits, to figure out subsidies for people, to figure out real wages that it takes to live in New York. Because, you know, unless we start addressing that issue, the social issues that follow through are not going to get any better. They're just going to get worse and worse and worse. And we see that. We see that, you know, that the change over time in poverty, in the kind of, you know, health that in people's lives, the homelessness issue, you know, it just gets exacerbated year after year the way, as the income gap increases.
Yeah. And I think that the rising costs, that inflation is causing, you know, it's just putting disproportionate impact, a lot of pressure on households that are disproportionately below the self-sufficiency standard, the true cost of living here. You know, I have some specifics. So if we look at certain categories of households, that we have 4 out of 5 households in Central Bronx, among all households in Central Bronx, had income that was below the true cost of living. It was 4 out of 5 single mothers, 4 out of 5 households where the highest educational attainment was a high school diploma amongst the adults. 4 out of 5 households that are linguistically isolated and Spanish speaking. And 4 out of 5 households that were headed by a Latina adult without citizenship. And so 80%, those are really striking. But those data points, I think, touch on the general findings throughout the report. You know, single mothers, persons of color, foreign-born, households with less education and fewer workers had, you know, higher rates of income inadequacy. But I just want to add, you know, one more thing and touch on that. Among those households that are below the true cost of living, 80% have at least one worker, and 66% of the householders have at least some college or more. So just dealing with jobs and education is not going to close that gap between income and earnings.
Yep. Okay, so we've come, the card was flashed that says end. So we've come to an end. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to Myrtle and to Lisa and to Dr. Pierce. Thank you.
So if we can thank our speakers one more time, that was a very sobering reality. So Myrtle, Lillian, Lisa, thank you so much. I think that I hear the call to action for sure, but I can't help but think about our poet this morning just calling us and daring us that this is the year. And I wonder, is this really the year? Is this really the year that New York State and New York City will listen to 42 other states who have said, this is a study worth listening to, this is a study worth taking into consideration as we make policy decisions. And when I think about the fact that 4 out of 5 households with working adults who are linguistically isolated, who have at least one person who's foreign-born, folks who come here because there's a dream that they were bought into and want to contribute to the city, and they can't even make ends meet. And when I think about a post-pandemic world where that alligator mouth is getting bigger and bigger, I think we have a responsibility. And on that note, I can't think of a better partner to come up and talk to us, not just about what the public sector can do, but what the private sector can do. Kathy Wall has been a hero in New York City. I think as the CEO of the Partnership for the City of New York, she has been a voice at the table to hold the private sector accountable, but also to come up with amazing solutions to help the city. So it is an honor for me to have her not only be in this room, present the next panel, but also be a partner with us as we look at these complex solutions and think about how the private sector can really be a bridge to solving some of these problems. So Kathy, thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking the time to be here. I know your busy schedule, so.
Thank you, Grace and Lizette, and I was pleased to be included. I think, obviously, the research, the study is compelling, frightening, but I'm afraid I'm going to give a message that just makes the problem more complicated, because the affordability crisis in New York City is affecting far more than the 50% of households that this study targets. And it is across the board between workers and residents and employers. It's a huge problem. We did a morning consult survey in February of a cross-section of the population on what are their top concerns. And there's crime and homelessness, but affordability, particularly housing affordability, has now reached 88% of the respondents. And these are mostly, this is across the board, all New Yorkers said that affordability was their top concern, their top issue. And particularly, as your research showed, the worst responses in terms of the ability to continue to live in the city were from the Bronx and from the Hispanic Latinx population. So it's the findings are very consistent with what you're talking about. Today, New York City is tied with Singapore for being the most expensive city in the world. 1 decade ago, there were 25 countries where the cities had higher costs than New York. So this is a relatively recent and escalating phenomenon in New York City. And it's become an increasing problem in terms of talking to employers, recruiting young people to the city, retaining families in the city. In other words, a real threat to our talent pool is this affordability crisis. So this is, in terms of this being the year, this is a year when I think everybody is recognizing across the board, if we don't fix the affordability crisis, this city is in real trouble. So I think you are totally bringing to the table research that's relevant to the decisions of today. Unfortunately, there's a large gap between the results of all our work and research and where political thinking is. And you'll see that, I want to say, this is not a matter of just raising salaries, although obviously the minimum wage in New York City has to increase. This is not just about more subsidies and benefits, although that has to increase. Public assistance has gone up 39% since 2020, number of public assistance recipients. So those social programs, even at the lower standards, are having to respond. But it's a much bigger issue today that we have to start thinking about. How do we make our city more affordable? One really disappointing thing to me is what has happened in the budget negotiations over the housing issue and the governor's housing compact. And I usually wouldn't be caught dead quoting Paul Krugman, but you must read his column today, because he writes about what's wrong with New York City. It's NIMBYism. And if you look at the conversation that happened in the legislature over the last month over the governor's housing compact, and her housing compact, it wasn't about spending money. It was about rational things that we can do to increase housing availability and reduce housing costs. And it was everything from accessory dwelling units, which California has done and which would make so much sense here in terms of being able to reallocate our resources, to lifting zoning caps that artificially depress the number of units that can be built, to transit-oriented housing being built in the suburbs under a mandate, which for those of us who remember Mount Laurel knew that wasn't going to happen, but or would take eons. But the point is, the governor put forward a lot of solutions that did not cost a lot of money and was prepared to also spend money on particularly supportive housing, mental health, other housing, and we have nothing. And we have had no housing production program now for a year, and there's nothing in sight. There is no housing proposal for either preservation or production programs to replace the failed programs that we had before that, you know, didn't solve the problem, but now we have literally nothing. The legislature will likely go home without doing anything. And this is just unacceptable. So I think your study comes at a really important moment, and it's something that we now have to figure out. How do you execute on this research to be able to make the case? Unfortunately, even if you're talking about great things like the climate advocates, there is no contemplation of the affordability of the implementation of the new standards for emissions. And that decision was made, those plans are put out without considering the impact on affordability. Our property taxes, a third of your rent is going for property taxes. And everybody's complaining about the rent. Very often, particularly in older buildings, it's not the landlords getting rich, it's the government taking 30% of the revenues from the building for property taxes, which in turn may or may not translate into affordability measures. So this is real complicated stuff. It now costs between $550,000 and $800,000 to build a new unit of housing in this city. That plus $1,000 a month in operating costs, and that translates into rents of $7,000, $8,000 a month without subsidy. And so we're talking about huge cost increases. We have to begin to deal with that. And so I would just strongly urge that you take today's study and put it together in a larger context, because the broader community has to engage on these issues. They're feeling the pinch, and I think this is an opportunity to not keep talking about just what government can do, but what we all have to do to fix this. So thank you, and I'll introduce the next panel. So, sorry to be depressing, but the situation is depressing. Okay, so Basil Smikle is going to be the moderator of the incoming panel, and it describes Basil here as a distinguished lecturer and director of the Public Policy Program at Roosevelt House Institute, and much more. Long history. Thank you, Basil. And am I supposed to introduce the other guests as well? Okay. Debash Nagash is here from the Mayor's Office of Equity, Deputy Commissioner. Alyssa Simon, who is the managing partner of Ernst & Young's New York office, and my friend Christine Quinn, the leader of WIN, Women in Need.
Everybody microphoned up. Awesome. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Morning. In light of Stephanie's words today, I'm going to ask for a little indulgence for the moderator to note the passing of Harry Belafonte this morning. In my Jamaican household in the Bronx, he was a God king, and as he says, an entertainer with a rebel heart. And in the course of the day today, just take a moment, given who is here in this room and why we're here, to take a moment to just think about his life and legacy and the impact on all of us. So as we begin today, first of all, everybody, thank you so much for being here this morning. Debash, Deputy Commissioner, I'd like to start with you. Tell us about your role at in the Mayor's Office of Equity. And how do you envision the True Cost of Living report influencing city policies and initiatives to tackle the kind of income inadequacy that we heard about today?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having us, and thank you, United Way, and everyone who's taken time to pull this together. It's so wonderful to be here. The Mayor's Office of Equity was established way back in 2022. So we're quite a new office. Been around for about 11 months. But, you know, we I just want to recognize, and I think this has been a thread today, equity work is not new to the city. It's not new to communities, particularly communities of color. And in a lot of ways, the city has been taking many steps over the course of many years in different pockets of government to center equity in its work. I think the difference now is that with this office, we're looking at how we can center equity and racial justice across city agencies and city systems, which I think is a big step for us. And the true cost of living was also mentioned earlier today from the racial justice ballot measures that were passed last November, and I'm sure many people in the room we are to thank you for that. But our work, so I'll just say this quickly, our work is, we think about change in 3 different ways. We're thinking about culture change, so how we're breaking silos and shifting culture within government as well. I think that's a big step that we need to take. There are a lot of folks, hundreds of thousands of people that work within the city, and how we empower them to center equity in their work is going to be critical moving forward, right outside of structure and laws and other things that we're discussing today. So that's something that we're looking to approach very intentionally. Second, I would say, is just changing, when we say change, changing outcomes. So creating equitable outcomes for New Yorkers. And in that respect, we're looking at how we can create multi-agency equity plans that focus on reducing to eliminate specific disparities within the city. And that work for us started with the Task Force on Racial Inclusion and Equity, which was launched back in 2020, remember that? When we were in the midst of a global pandemic and needed to recognize in that moment that there were certain communities that were experiencing this pandemic in a very different way, and in a very painful way, and are continue to be impacted by that. And so it started there, and thanks again to the votes last November. That's been codified in the charter as well. It was also initially led by Grace Bonilla, thank you, and then led by our Commissioner, Sadia Sherman. So as we continue, and then lastly, I'll just mention structural change is really a big piece of this. And again, and I'll talk more about the racial justice ballot measures later, but that is really looking at, the Racial Justice Commission was really asked to look at the city charter and look at how we're rooting out structural racism and within the charter, and placing those, taking a couple of ballot measures, placing them on folks' ballot and asking them to vote. So as we move forward, we're looking again at those things: structural change, culture change, and equitable outcomes. And this report comes at a very opportune moment, where we can take what we're seeing and use it as a tool when we're building equity agendas, when we're thinking about how our city agencies and our city as a whole approaches creating a city racial equity plan, and also how the city and our government is also held accountable to that. So this is, an opportune moment, really, where, I think this was discussed earlier too, where like all these stars are sort of aligning. And we're thrilled to be, helping to lead that.
Thank you. Thank you. We heard earlier, Alicia, from Kathy Wild about bringing the private sector to the table. You are the managing partner of Ernst & Young in the Metro New York City office. So could you talk about the role of the private sector in addressing some of the findings of this report, and how you're contributing to the effort?
Sure, and I do recognize I'm probably one of the only few people from the private sector here, so thank you for having me. This is actually very eye-opening. But us in the private sector have to work with the public sector and nonprofits together in a collaboration, right? So we at Ernst & Young, I oversee 13,000 people here in New York City, so 13,000 employees. And when we think about our employee pool, I think Lisette said it great. Talent is here. We have talent in New York City. And it's about ensuring that the talent we have has the skills that enable them to apply for jobs at EY, right? So it's how do we get them in the door and how do we hire the talent that we already have? So a lot of things with the collaboration of the Mayor's Office through the Future of Work Task Force, as well as the Jobs Council that I'm a proud part of, are ways that we can think about hiring differently. And so taking the Jobs Council, for example, that's a group of 30-plus companies here in New York City who really have come together and said, how are we going to hire collectively 100,000 New Yorkers over 10 years? And some of the things we did was, one, looking at the job recs we have, what skills do we hire for, right? So where is there a gap? So how do we go into those communities and get in the schools and say, here are the skills that you need for you to be, to get an internship and then to launch a career, and really get them at a younger age. So going into the high schools and saying, here are the skills that you need, but not just saying, I'm an employer, I'm going to be over here, and I'm going to wait for that talent to get to high school or get to college. That's passing the baton. We're an employer here in New York City. This is our talent. So working with the schools, getting into the schools, training those students and saying, you don't have these skills, let us help you, let us train you. And so thinking about the skills and the skill gap there. And then the second thing is challenging our hiring requirements. Why does every job need a college degree? It doesn't. It doesn't. So here in New York City, we've really taken a step back and said, what jobs do some absolutely need a college degree, some and a lot do not. So where we have the opportunity to go to a community college and for an apprenticeship program and an associate's degree and say, you know what, I'm going to remove that barrier. I'm going to remove that barrier of requiring a college degree because now I've just increased my talent pool. There's tons of talented, willing, so skilled students through the CUNY system that we've been working with. And frankly, I do a lot of recruiting, I do a lot of interviewing, and when I get a resume, and I look at a resume, and a lot of times I'll see a student that has nothing extracurricular. Most of the time, other companies, and historically, that's kind of been put over here. What I like to do is I ask that student, tell me what you do every day. Tell me about a day in your life. And you'll find a lot of them, are in charge of their 3 brothers and sisters. They're taking 2 buses and a subway. They are going grocery shopping for their parents. Project management, financial literacy, all of those skills do not come across on a resume, but until you ask the question, they're missing that opportunity. And then the last thing I would say is, we've been challenging our hiring requirements. That will get them in the door. I want them to have a career. So if I can hire you at a junior level and I take away that requirement, does that mean you can get promoted? Does that mean, again, there's going to be a barrier for you can't get promoted to manager or go up the ranks? I want to remove those barriers so that way anyone can go all the way up to CEO. And so thinking about things like that is what we in the private sector have to do, but in collaboration with the public and the nonprofits.
I have to take a moment and just say, as I think about all my students at Hunter College, many of them first generation college students, and that is one of the biggest, what you said touched on one of the biggest roles that I have, which is talking to them about how to value the work they already do. How to attach value to that, how to monetize that in some respects, right? But also, one of the barriers that we face so often is because they have so many responsibilities at home, outside of the home, internships need to be able to pay something. As opposed, they don't have the opportunity to take internships for free. So we try to do as much as we can to be able to subsidize the work so that they can get that experience. So, thank you for touching on many of those issues. Christine Quinn, before I ask you a question, I wanted you to consider also unpacking some of the findings, which was that employment is key to income adequacy in New York City, but it's not a guarantee. And among households with at least one full-time year-round worker, Income inadequacy rates are 40% compared to 95% for households with no workers. About 80 out of 100 households below the TCL, true cost of living, however, have at least one part-time worker. And what I wanted to come to you with was, how can insights from the report be used to develop more targeted and effective policies and programs to uplift communities facing these highest levels of economic insecurity?
Well, first, let's step back for a second, right? So Kathy said, which I appreciate, that this report is depressing. This report is not depressing. This report is a solution. And by definition, solutions are uplifting, not depressing. And I say that because often people say to me, oh, how do you do work with the homeless? It must be so horrible. First of all, it's the opposite, because they're the most resilient women I've ever met in my life. But the number of people in shelter at any given time is a fact. It's just a number, right? Reports like this and other things are the solution. And the key, I believe, to ending the homeless crisis is saying we are going to end the homeless crisis, which is what this report does. And stop managing the homeless crisis, quite frankly, if you're an elected official, managing it off the cover of the New York Post, so you don't have to worry about it anymore. So take this report. It shows what we know at WIN, that homeless people in homeless shelters are working. Give or take 30%, I'm not always so perfect with the numbers, as Kathy could tell you, when we work together in government, 30% of those who enter WIN, adults, are working. When they leave, over 50% are working. But over 30% are working and they're in shelter. They couldn't afford the rent. That's a terrible statement. 250 of our families during the height of the pandemic were essential workers. Just think about that for a second. Okay, so we know we don't have the problem of people being lazy like we were told. We don't have the problem of people not wanting to work. We don't have the problem of people not having the ability to work. The problem we have is that they're not in the right jobs and that jobs don't pay enough. That's fixable. At WIN, we have an income building program. The mother said to us, don't call it job training. I know how to work. I have a job. What I need is more money. I need more income. We have an income building program. And it does the traditional things like interviewing and clothes and all that stuff, but it also works on training specific to the kind of jobs our moms want and specific to where there are openings in a sector where there would be good pay and matching skills our moms have. And an array of other real placement type things versus just giving the skills, getting people into the job and following up. Most of our income building program, the vast majority, is paid for by private sector money that we now will get from Ernst & Young, I'm fairly certain, and that we get from other, companies. That is great that we raised it. But not every group is as big as WIN and has the ability to raise money like that. So this fact, the solution is the city needs to add into the contracts for homeless shelters money for income building programs and job placement. That's what this report tells us, and that's what we need to do immediately. Now, as was said before, somebody will say, well, you're spending $4 billion on shelter. Okay. But when the person leaves, even with a subsidy, and comes back, you're paying more than if a shelter had gotten a couple $100,000 extra and actually got people placed into good jobs. We at WIN have a college readiness program and a small scholarship program for incidentals that's paid for by AT&T and Kelly Ripa and Mark Consuelos. And that last year, 33 kids went to college from shelter, which is a big deal. Those children are going to be more likely never to return to shelter. They're going to be more likely to help their parents get out of shelter if they're still in shelter. Yet again, you didn't hear me say a city agency that funds that. I don't mind raising that money, but others can't. If we're going to have equity, we need to add that into the contracts, because one of the greatest indicators for why someone becomes a homeless adult is them having been a homeless child. So we need to really take these findings and use them as the solution, and then back into the places where we are missing the mark. It's not that complicated. Now, there are parts of this that are really challenging. 80% of the moms that win report being a domestic violence survivor. If 80% report it, it's really 100%. Now, that is hard and beyond the scope, except we know one of the ways domestic violence plays out is through financial abuse and running up debt on the survivor's credit card, which puts them in a bad place, which means we need more support working with homeless women for fixing credit. So these are the kind of things we need to put in place that this report shows us, and makes this report really a living document that could put us in a position 5 years from now to come back and say the numbers are much lower, and the revolving door part of people having to go into shelter more than once has decreased.
You know, I always try to center my students in all the work that I do, and I have to tell you, one of the biggest, more and more of my students are doing their research projects on being young and homeless. And it's startling and it's shocking, and you can see how these concerns are filtering to the most vulnerable among us. So this is a real question for all of you. I'll start with you, Deputy Commissioner. Because you've all talked about the role that the private sector can play, the nonprofit work, but also, how do we bring elected officials and the decision makers to the table? How do we make sure that the most vulnerable among us are getting their voices heard, particularly around these issues?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think one thing we've been thinking a lot about and have been focused on is bringing in, and this was mentioned a little earlier, but this, it was mentioned earlier, this work from this report has been going on for 20 years. There are a lot of good ideas, programs, things that have been implemented successfully that we can build on. And so in our work, what we're thinking about is taking those things and bringing them to the table rather than trying to recreate. And that's been a huge focus for us, and that includes bringing in elected officials and others who can really provide a unique lens in all of this work so we can ensure that we're being inclusive. I think for us, it's also thinking about how we approach our work from a place-based lens as well. The Bronx was mentioned quite a bit today. I think lots of folks here know what the disparities are, but I think what we also talk a little bit about when we're thinking about how we approach that work is what are the assets that we can build on in a borough like that. And so that's really how we've thought through this work. It's simple, yet it's been very challenging, is really listening. And listening meaning hearing and taking that and having it guide the way that we approach and implement our work.
Alicia, I asked you the same question or a similar question about bringing the most vulnerable to the table, but since you talked a lot about working with young students, high school students and such, if you can amplify that a little bit, talk a little bit more about that work.
Yes, I mean, going to the outer boroughs and training the students on skills that they need to get gainful employment is really, really important. But I also think we just need to keep advocating, right? As a large employer in the city, we love having our footprint here. And I think Kathy said that it was the second most expensive city now. If we can't, as a business, we need our people to live here, and we want them to enjoy this amazing city, and not just live here, but thrive. I want to have, working moms who can take their kids to the Bronx Zoo and have the time, the flexibility on the weekends to work remotely and have all those benefits that they should have. So I think it's advocating why is it so expensive. As an employer, we want to be here, but also addressing those skill gaps and getting the kids younger, right? So training them at a younger age about the importance of these skills and how if you if we can empower them, train them, and then put them on a pathway, a different pathway to gainful employment, then they'll be the ones that are going back to their parents and hopefully taking their grandkids to the Bronx Zoo someday. So I think it's two things. I think it's getting the kids younger, but I also think it's advocating as businesses and collectively, right? So not just EY, but all of the businesses here, and say, we want our footprint here. We want our headquarters here. And that is really important to keep raising that flag.
Chris, I'll ask you a similar question about engaging as a former elected official, elected officials now, and bringing all of the stakeholders to the table. And I actually have a follow-up after that, but if you can speak to that.
So at WIN, we're the largest provider of shelter and permanent supportive housing to homeless families with children in the city. So what we see is statistically significant. So we have an advocacy department, but we also make it clear to elected officials, if you need info, if you need facts, we'll make them available, and then you'll do what you will. So I'll give you an example. Well, also in developing our policy, the policy and advocacy department goes to the staff, the frontline staff, and says, what are you seeing? And also meets with clients to hear what you're seeing. So, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, Councilmember Steve Levin was then chair of the General Welfare Committee, and he said, I'm hearing all over town that homeless people can't use their voucher to rent apartments. It's not working. It's not enough money. What's going on? So we set up a meeting with him and about 6 or 7 of our housing coordinators, who are like our real estate agents, if you will. Out of that came a bill that raised the amount of the housing voucher from $1,500 to $2,200 with incremental increases every year. But that came directly from the client experiences as expressed to an elected official. So we've been, when we got that passed in the final days of the de Blasio administration, the administration opposed it, but we were able to convince them not to veto it, to just let it pass without signature. I just thought I'd mention that randomly. We really work on developing those relationships and bringing the staff who's working directly with the clients, and the clients when they're comfortable. Sometimes they don't want to meet with the elected officials, and we have to respect that as well. Right now, we have 247 asylum-seeking families at WIN shelters, which includes 700 children, and we are doing town hall meetings with those clients directly, so their voices can, be brought to elected officials, doing legal clinics with the Fragerman Law Firm to get them a legal game plan for each of their situations. And we had representatives of a number of elected officials, and which council member came to the clinic? Councilmember Hanif, come to one of the immigration legal clinics to see it firsthand. And so we try to make ourselves available in that way all the time.
You mentioned the migrant crisis. I didn't intend to ask you about it, but how difficult, well, we know it's a difficult situation. How's the city, if you could talk a little bit about that, manage it? We heard the mayor sort of really begging, if we could say that, the president for help and support. How dire is this situation?
I mean, it's a very challenging situation. There's no question. We will spend probably over $1 million more than we were budgeted to on client services. These families come with nothing but the clothes on their back. They are eligible presently for no services, no food stamps. So, we have food pantries in every shelter, but that's just to hold you over a couple days till your food stamps get turned on. That doesn't exist, right? So on our Amazon wish list right now, we have chicken, right? I've never had chicken on the Amazon wish list before. But I want to say, as big of an issue as it is, there are things the city could do. Right now there is no exit plan out of shelter. If we made the city voucher available to undocumented people, which has been talked about many, many times before and is legal, these folks would have an exit plan. They don't presently, and the city and the state could do that. Also, I think it's really important to, pound the federal government to get us more money, pound the state government to get us money, but we cannot demonize these individuals. They have risked their lives, they've fled violence and sex trafficking and horrible, horrible poverty that we can't even understand, and we have to be very mindful of that.
Thanks so much. Deputy Commissioner, I want to go back to you because you did mention the racial justice ballot measure. How does this report tie into what the city is doing to implement that measure from an equity perspective?
Yeah, so back in 2021,
It's forever ago.
I know, I keep saying back because it feels like it was a long time
It does
ago,
feel
but
that
it really
way.
wasn't. The Racial Justice Commission, Charter Revision Commission, was tasked with really looking at racial inequity across the city and really looking specifically within the charter, and put forward 3 questions that were on our ballot last November. So one of those was adding a statement of values to our charter, our city charter, really to guide how the city will center racial equity and justice in its work. And also as an accountability measure, that's something that, like, it's a North Star that our city has to continue to go back to as it establishes policy, makes investments in our work, in our city. The other is the establishment of a true cost of living measure, which is very exciting. The first will be published next March, and the city is also responsible for publishing that every year after. And that's a really, again, this has been done for 20 years. There's so much wisdom to learn from, and so much work that's already been done. And we're extremely grateful for that. But having this as part of our city charter is a really important step, because it also brings this, it requires the city to take action in many ways across the board on policy and programs, but it also, the idea is for this to also influence state and federal policymakers as well. And obviously we want to be a partner in that. And then lastly, it's one of the other ballot measures also involves establishing an Office of Racial Equity, a racial equity plan for the city, and a commission on racial equity as well, to assess those plans and provide input and to help guide them, to your point about ensuring that folks have a seat at the table. So this work is really just beginning, and a lot of our initial deadlines begin towards the end of this year and at the start of next year. So the true cost of living report is really going to, again, I said it's going to serve as a tool and be part of every discussion in, like, how do we take a tool like this, and when an agency is creating its city or its racial equity plan, and we're rolling that up into a larger plan, how do we center these findings in building that plan out, and specifically financial, not just financial stability, but financial mobility as part of that.
Thank you. I have one more question in the time that we have left, but before I give that question, just a reminder that you can, the audience is free to ask questions of our panel. I think we still have, well, not much time, but we'll do the sort of lightning round. Please answer in the form of a question. We'll do sort of a lightning round if we have a moment. But the last question for all of you is twofold. One, can you give us some hope for the future based on the work that you're doing, based on this report? What is the hope for the future? And also give us a call to action. What can we do once we leave this room to advance the work that you all are doing? Anyone can start.
I'll start. So we had one of our clients go into her closet in her shelter unit and take out clothes she didn't need and put them in a box, and went around the shelter asking her other neighbors to do the same, and then put the box in the lobby, and that was free clothes for the asylum seekers. So if you can be in a homeless shelter with your children and you can feel a sense of abundance, that you have more than you need, and you can see someone else who needs it more than you, to me that is remarkably, remarkably inspiring. And if you would leave here and urge the mayor to and the governor, urge the mayor and the governor, I don't care which one does it, to expand the city voucher program to undocumented New Yorkers, it will be a game changer.
Thank you.
So I think one of the things through the last couple years working on these initiatives that's really surprised me is sort of the disconnect between the expectation of the talent at some of the community colleges and looking at students and saying, they have a really low GPA, they are struggling in community college, they aren't showing up for class, they must be lazy, they must not be smart. They must not care. And that could not be farther from the truth from these kids that we learned, spending time with them. You just don't know what is on their plates. You don't know what their story is. You don't know what's going on in their lives. And all of them have inspired me so much to the point where we're literally challenging our hiring standards. And let's look at the talent, the raw talent, but also giving them the platform and training them for the skills to get them to the next level. So I have been so inspired by the students at CUNY that we've worked with in a way that I honestly never imagined, and they have far exceeded our expectations. So that is my aha moment. But my call of action is also for anyone else who in this room who hires, take a look at your hiring requirements. Take a look at, maybe there are some barriers that you are putting up that frankly don't need to be there anymore. Taking a look at the skills that you're hiring for and how do you get into your community, get into the schools, and then train those students for those skills so that way they can apply for those jobs. But take a look at your requirements and just ask the question, just because we've always held this standard doesn't mean that we still need to.
Yeah. I would just say, one thing I just want to say quickly is I loved hearing from the two of you. I feel like I find my own personal story in some of the things that you've shared, which also gives me a little bit of hope personally. I'll just say, I'm a daughter of immigrants. My family came from East Africa seeking asylum in this country. And I remember the first person who gave me an internship opportunity and actually valued the type of work that I brought to the table, which wasn't traditional. So I do, I find hope in that. But I'll just also add, I think, one important thing that, our work will involve over the course of the next year is looking at, is focusing on structural change and how we not just focus on policy and programs that we can implement, which are certainly important, but looking at city systems across the board and how we need to change them when they're not responding appropriately to the needs of New Yorkers and people in the city. So I would say, one call to action, I think, is for everyone in this room to think about, how you can create that structural change within your own organization, which I think is really important. I think sometimes we forget to look internally when we're talking about this kind of change and equity, and that's where it really begins. And then lastly, I'll just say, I think conversations like this create a spark, but it takes time for a spark to catch, you gotta let it catch and turn into a flame. So I hope that, the discussions that we've had here today also that spark catches and people take it out of the room with them and turn it into action with this tool.
Thank you. Any questions from our audience? I'll use that time then for 30 seconds just to give my own moment of hope and call to action. A personal story as well. I went to Cornell undergrad and I was talking to a young man who was thinking about dropping out. And I grew up in the Bronx. My mother's a school teacher for 30 years, taught public school, special ed in Queens for 30 years. And trying to mentor this young man, and I said, you are not alone, because I left the Bronx and went to Cornell, and I didn't know how much I didn't know. So many of us were pretty smart but under-resourced. And all we needed was to be able to see someone and talk to someone to give us that opportunity. I thank you for the work you're doing at CUNY and for those who are CUNY attached in this room, because it is such an extraordinary economic magnifier, amplifier for so many of those students. And I hope that the young man stays involved, because I was on food stamps my 4 years at Cornell. And my degree doesn't say that I was on food stamps, doesn't even say that I was black. I just have the same Bachelor of Science that everybody else got. And made my mama proud.
And don't you have a couple letters after your name now, Basil?
I have 3 letters. It's their PhD, and I got that. I actually just got it. It took me 7 years to do it, but I did it. And thank you for raising that. She knew me when I didn't have one, and but I say that to say that so many of the students, so many of the young people we interact with, have absorbed all of the anxiety and the tension that the adults are feeling, and I see it. We all see it. And so the call to action is that there are a lot of folks out there, a lot of young people in particular, that are walking around with a tremendous amount of trauma that gets undiscussed and unmentioned. And that as we think about all the work that we are called to do and that we will do based on this report, I always go back to, let's center our babies in this conversation as well. So thank you all, and thank you all for allowing us to be here.
So thank you again to our panelists and for bringing the hope back into the room. I'm still struck by something that Myrtle said, that after the first study, working moms knew it wasn't their fault. And the fact that this panel just demonstrated how easy it can be, and it's a complicated issue, I'm not overselling it, but how easy it can be to actually see New Yorkers, actually see the people that are working as hard as they can to make ends meet. I was excited to have EY as a moment of personal privilege. When we have an amazing board member from EY on our board, and when we reached out and said, we know what you're doing, we want to highlight it. So Alicia, thank you for being here with us and allowing us to bring an example of how the private sector can really show up. And talk about wanting to be seen, wanting to create a city where we belong. I am really honored at this point to introduce Jumaane Williams, our public advocate, who is in the car, I believe. Still in the car? So, yes, there he is. And I'm excited to introduce him because he ran on a platform of equity, of racial inclusion, of making sure the barriers were not part of the story that New Yorkers had to tend with as they were making the city better. So without further ado, from the car, talk about commitment, our public advocate, please help me welcome him.
Thank you so much. Peace and blessing, love and light, everyone. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me, so if someone can tell me if they're being heard. Yes. Oh, awesome. Thank you so much. And I apologize 1,000%. I really want to be the person. I'm still headed there. My wife is out of town for a few days, and Daddy has a lot to make up in efficiency that Mommy already has. So I'm working on it. So my deepest sincere apologies. I'll be here. That was an awesome panel. Thank you to the Deputy Commissioner, to Alicia, and to shout out to former Speaker Quinn, and of course my friend Basil Smythe. And I do always want to make sure, I'm a bit of a spicy person. I'm always in trouble, and so I did bring a lot of spice to the council when I was under Speaker Quinn. But she was not the speaker that punished me the most, so I was going to give her credit for that. And also, the 2 major things that I was able to accomplish, I think the most major, which is the changes we made in dealing with the police departments, the police stop and frisk, and the work that we did in addressing gun violence. Those came under Speaker King's tenure. So I just want to give her some credit for that as well. But, good morning again. Peace and blessings, love and light to you all. Thank you for having me. And thank you to the Ford Foundation. Thank you to United Way of New York City, the Fund for the City of New York, and all the organizers responsible for bringing us together for this conversation. I also want to acknowledge at the top that everything being discussed today, I know is made possible by contributors to this report, especially the researchers at University of Washington School of Social Work. Because of them, we can see the true scope of the problem, at least have it on paper, and add to anecdotes, real data. Now it's up to all of us to find the solutions and government push for those solutions to be enacted. New York City is not only the most unaffordable it has ever been, as this report details, but the most expensive city in the world. We have to take time to sit with that, the most expensive city in the world. And as we've heard all today, that title is not abstract. Not for millions of New Yorkers struggling to make ends meet, to pay rent, put food on the table, move around the city, raise a family. One aim of this report was to extend beyond traditional poverty measures in addressing impact. To get a real feel for the impact, I think it's important to be out in the streets and communities, speaking to, and more importantly, hearing from New Yorkers. That's why, as public advocate in my office, we established a very large community engagement and community affairs division to meet people where they are and address needs in specific policy areas. The work is urgent. As you heard, 50% of households, that's half of households in our city, do not meet the minimum cost of living here. The minimum. Forget about trying to take your family out for a vacation, trying to go to a movie. The minimum cost of living. It's outrageous and enraging to those who are conscious. The cost of living in New York is struggling to pay it. It's a policy failure that has been abound for years and decades. Even as many folks in this field and in this room and in other places have really tried to get government to address it, they didn't. And it's one we have a moral obligation to correct. It's not a new problem. And while many of the revelations in this report are shocking to the senses, they're probably not surprising to those who have been doing this work for a long time, who have seen the patterns of resource inequity for our entire careers, if not lives. At the same time, we're the most expensive. We have so many billionaires and millionaires who live right here as well. That inequity is palpable. Equally unsurprising is where the pain is being felt most deeply. In neighborhoods of more color, in immigrant communities and households run by a single mother, like mine was. I heard that the city commissioner mentioned. I am a son of immigrants. I'm a first-generation American. My mother was able to raise two knucklehead children by herself. I think she did fairly well. Resource inequity runs deep in this history of our city and the state and this country, and in these populations in particular, and I think on purpose, and I always have to mention and bring up, even within that sphere, a very specific anti-Black racism that's pervasive all over. I always make sure to talk about it in a way that has to do with resource inequity, not income inequality or inequality by itself, because it reflects the situation better. Resource inequity is what the problem is. The notion that income does not account for the entirety of the problem or the solution. This report shows that. It also shows that having a job is not the sole solution, even to become even to income inadequacy. We know people who are working full-time, who are homeless, who still cannot make ends meet. I know people think just because you're rich, that means you work harder. I know some folks in NYC who work harder than Jeff Bezos in one day than he does in a whole year. Households headed by people of more color or single mothers experience lower returns for the same work effort. For example, even when there is one Latino or Latinx worker with a full-time year-round job, 50% of these households still struggle to meet basic needs, compared with 24% of white households with at least one full-time worker. People of more color, particularly Latino, Latinx, American Indian, and Black households are disproportionately more likely to struggle with income insecurity. These realities fall along the deliberate structural lines drawn and systems created by those with power. These statistics and the structures that prop them up are indefensible in our present and unsustainable for our future, particularly as we see the greatest need among households with children. None of us, I always say, are responsible for the systems or the problems that we inherit, but I do know that all of us are responsible for the ones that we leave behind. It's really important to make notion of that, because when you talk about classism, racism, sexism, people usually get defensive. And it's important to know that you don't have to be sexist, racist, classist to move forward a system that's rooted in all of those. You don't have to be transphobic or homophobic to move forward a system that's rooted in all of those things. And I believe all of those things are rooted in the inequity that we have and who's most affected. So let's get to work, because in my office, across portfolios and issues, we're working on a number of policies that can have real impact in addressing what's revealed in this report. The largest expense for New Yorkers is housing. Rents are skyrocketing, and conditions are deteriorating in buildings across the city while homeowners are being squeezed out, their homes being taken from them. In addition to our annual worst landlord list to hold these bad actors accountable, my office is working to help pass good cause eviction in the state protections and the housing access voucher programs on the state level to help people get into homes and protect them from unjust rent increases. Additionally, we need to build more deeply affordable income targeted housing because even in this moment, everything is affordable to someone. We need housing that's actually affordable to the people living in the community, and no housing plan is complete unless we talk about the ability to maintain and preserve what we have. So we have to preserve, build the units that we have with things like good cause eviction. Achieving that, well, this could be another entire speech, but it requires, as I mentioned, building units, preserving what we have. No plan to address the affordable housing and homelessness crisis is real without a majority of units being preserved. I know right now on the state level, there are plans to create this type of housing, and I'm really glad about that, but it's critical that these plans are developed with the communities that are being impacted and desperately trying not to be priced out. We tend to do things to communities, not with communities. I also believe we need to expand New York's ability to control their own housing costs, pass the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, and move toward what some call social housing, but I consider equity housing. Now that these issues are removed from the state budget, I'm hoping a real conversation can happen and real solutions pass to bringing true affordable housing to our streets. I'm very concerned that the governor spent more time pushing a bare reform, which is not the thing that people need the most, than something like housing, where everybody knows affordability is the #1 issue in our city and our state. Under our streets, public transportation is getting more expensive and services not improving to match. That's why my office is advocating to expand fair fares now and work toward ultimately free, effective public transport options that can move New Yorkers around the city. A core of this affordability crisis is that costs are rising massively faster than wages. I was proud to be a part of the fight for 15 when they said it couldn't be done. But in the time since that win, even in the time it took to implement the law, the number has become out of date and inadequate. I'm now fighting to not only increase the minimum wage, city and statewide, but to tie future increases to the cost of living. Inflation can't leave hardworking New Yorkers behind, nor can the desire of companies to put profits over people lead to worker abuses. We have to continue to fight for worker protections. And while parents are at work, we need to increase access to child care services, a massive cost that we need to take off New Yorkers' burden in child care like UPK and U3K. That's a philosophy I see resound in all of our government. And at a time when some of our leaders are urging cuts to city services, the way to make New York affordable is to invest in these services. Austerity cuts have never made it safer, and they have never made cities better. Finally, to make the city and state affordable to most, we can't be afraid of raising revenue from the people for whom affordability is no issue. We have to raise revenue from the people who can afford it the most. There are common sense measures my office is continuing to push, and I'm hopeful to see them pass. Each of us has to support our fellow New Yorkers. That includes, and probably especially, the ultra wealthy. None of these changes on their own will reverse the tide. We have to be part of a larger comprehensive vision for our city, for our state, one that's for the people, not just the super wealthy. We hear often that if we enact these measures, people will leave the state. We hear that we can't put in place progressive economic policies or people will leave. The truth of the matter is, wealthy people have not left our city. The people who have left are the people who cannot afford here, and that is usually Black and brown working class individuals and families. I can't close without acknowledging the fact that what deepened all of these issues that define our lives and will continue to define our reality in some years to come, the pandemic. The pandemic exacerbated all of these issues, it's true. But in most cases, with the exception of public safety, the trend lines were already there. The structures were already in place. And that's why I've always said we cannot simply be content to return to the status quo, return to normal. We can't. Too many people's lives have been lost to return to normal. I have to say fundamentally, what I think we need to change is where you all are right now, where I have just pulled up to, just because of where someone is born, who they're born to, the generational wealth that's come to them. They have to work really, really, really hard to fail. Just a few miles away, because where that person was born, who they were born to, the generational wealth that was taken away, they have to work really, really, really hard to succeed. And that's unfair. And that's what we really need to change. These are very precarious moments for our city. We have to decide if we're going to listen to the loudest voices trying to preserve the status quo and wealth, or combine the millions of too often unheard voices to demand the change we need. I really appreciate the support. I appreciate the event today. Peace and blessings. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity. And let's continue the work that needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I want to make it a point to say something that I think is important to say, because we so often come in these spaces and we put our positionality aside as if that happens. But the fact that Grace and I, both as Latinas here, we represent the 20% that can take care of our children, have reached economic success, and 80% of our sisters are left behind, right? Like, that hits me in a very deep way, because we are also in an election cycle where the role and perpetuation of stigma and shame is monetized, is encouraged, and is politicized. And then we also culturally are in a time where people romanticize sacrifice as sacrificio, right? And so the work that we do is not just about what's coming out of this report. It's about understanding the narratives that a Grace and I are not exceptions to the rule. We just come from exceptional people, which are much brighter and much broader and not always as visibly seen. I just felt the need to say that. I want to also recognize a couple of things. We have Abby Jo Siegel here in the audience, who is working on a mayor's plan to think about what does it mean to have a just and inclusive talent and workforce development system. Thank you for being here, because when you talk about these areas, they all intersect. I want to thank the coalition partners that are with us, at least 25 of them. And I really want to encourage all of you that the New York City True Cost of Living Report, to just share it. Share this. It's important. Share it in multiple languages. En inglés, en español, whichever way you want to do it. It's really important to get that out. And also, if you heard today, our neighbors are struggling in historic numbers, and this requires a historic response. And yet they are struggling. I want us to also see where that they are asset-based as well, too. I think that's really important, that in this conversation, that the work that did start with Myrtle and with Diane and others it was not about saying what were the deficits. It was about saying, what does it mean to have these assets that are overlooked, right? So as we create this narrative with this report, let's remember asset first, okay? On your program, you're going to see one of those QR codes. Everybody see those, right? That links to the site on the truecostofliving.org. There you'll find a full report to download, data dashboards, yummy stuff. This is the academic side of me, so good. Media coverage, a social media toolkit, right? I encourage you also to create your own social media toolkit, right? Because I think it's important for those who work closest with communities, they know what's translatable and makes sense. Let's keep this conversation going towards a brighter future for New Yorkers. There is only an abundance of talent here, and we just need to see it and support it. It's not lost on me that we compared ourselves to Singapore as being the place that's the highest cost of living, yet we don't look at Singapore that has the highest subsidies in housing and supports for childcare. That's for another conversation, right? Along with their challenges, but that's two areas that they definitely have stepped up. And so then the last thing is, too, may we all sit and rejoice in being New Yorkers who care deeply about this, who care deeply about what this future can be, that we care deeply about what collaboration means. Look at these incredible partners here, and I get to turn it over to my partner in progress, not in crime, but progress, right? Grace Bonilla at the United Way. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lisette. I want to take a moment to thank my team who's put up with my 1,000 questions. Among them, Elizabeth Angeles, thank you so much for the work you did today. And deep thanks to Lisette. I'm glad that she brought our people into the room, because even though it was the two of us standing up here, It was no accident that we were up here. In my personal story, I'm also the daughter of immigrants. My parents would have never imagined that I would be standing here talking to you all, but this is the city that makes that possible. And what's heartbreaking to me is that we're raising a generation of young people who may not see themselves in these roles, who may not think that this city has opportunities for them because we have not addressed. In fact, we've made worse the infrastructures that are supposed to support them. So we are here because we are like-minded people who want to make the city better. So I urge you to please take this study and use it in your advocacy when you're speaking to not just elected officials and people who are wonky like us, but to your neighbors. There is a reason why things are not working for them. There's a response that we need to have with a level of urgency that meets the moment. So I am grateful for the panelists who took the time. I see the public advocate made it out of the car, so thank you, sir, for being with us. And what an example of people trying to balance their lives, right? He is a dad who needed to take care of kids, but still made time to be here, so I'm thankful for you on a very personal level that you're here. So my call to action to all of us is do not let this moment pass us by. This is probably as worse as it should get. It cannot get, we've hit bottom. And now it's about the hope and the progress of pulling our city out of this with a level of equity and with a level of respect and dignity that this moment requires. So thank you for being with us today, and I look forward to working with all of you in the battle to save the city. Thank you. I'm taking my water.